Does God exist? Are science and faith enemies? Your host for this series was an atheist who became a believer in God through his studies in science. Here is public high school teacher John Clayton.
Of all the presentations in this series of videos designed to demonstrate that you can intelligently and logically believe in God, I think this one's probably the most important. If there was just one of my presentations I'd like for everybody to see is this one. Because I don't think there's any subject, any area of concern where there is more misunderstanding, where there's more bad information, more misconceptions involved in people's minds than the question of what is God. I was an atheist for 20 years. I was associated with a large number of very visible, well-known atheists. I worked as a leader in the atheist movement for a period of time. And yet I know now I never really understood what God was. I never understood what people were talking about when they talked about God. I'm not sure that most atheists understand what the concept of God is. I'm not really very sure that they really understand the whole development of what it means to believe in God. I think this is also true of agnostics. And as a matter of fact, I'm very sure that most people who believe in God really don't understand what God is. Let me just think about that for a minute. What do you understand God to be? When you think about God or when you hear the word God, what do you visualize? Or do you visualize anything? When you pray to God, if you do pray, what are you praying to? Is it something that looks a little bit like this? You know, the last course that I had in my graduate work was a course in physical anthropology taught by a pretty well-known atheist on campus. And the man began the class by saying, "Now we all know what God is. God is an old man in the sky with a long white beard and big white flowing robes." And that was honestly and sincerely the man's concept of God. Is that your concept of God? Have you created God in your image instead of the other way around? You know, that's easy to do, and quite frankly, I think we all do it to some extent. We all want a God that looks like us. We want a God that likes what we like, that doesn't like what we don't like, that has the same prejudices and the same problems and the same hang-ups that we have. And we have a tendency to create God in our own image. And we ask questions that demonstrate that we don't have the foggiest idea what God is. I hear these questions every weekend on university and college campuses all across this country. Questions like, what color of skin does God have? Questions like, what sex is God? Questions like, how can God hear my prayer and the prayer of the little boy in China at the same time? Questions like, who created God? Questions like, where did God come from? Questions like, why does God allow? And you fill in the blank. The latest tragedy, the latest major disease, personal problems in our own lives. See, all of these questions are rooted in a fundamental inability to understand what God is. And many of us were indoctrinated at a very early age with a completely fallacious concept of God. This picture is a picture taken from a very popular and very well done children's book. But the picture concept of God, I believe, is terribly misleading. In scientific journals, we frequently see this picture. And I fully understand that this is a very famous work of art. But what's the concept of God being given here? The male, human, Caucasian, white-haired old man in the sky. And what I'm saying to you is that if your concept of God is anything along the lines of the pictures that I've been showing you here for the last few minutes, not only is your concept illogical, not only is it irrational, not only is it beyond any reasonable defense whatsoever, but it is also not even remotely related to what God is. Now, I'd like to start this presentation by telling you a little fairy tale. This little fairy tale was written by a man by the name of Edwin Abbott, and it's called Flatland. Now, some of you may have studied this book in a topography class or in an analytical geometry or an abstract math class or something of this type. But this book was written for the purposes that I'm using it for in this video, which a lot of people don't know. Flatland is the story of a man who lives in a two-dimensional world. Now, what I mean by that is that he lives in a world that is like this sheet of paper. The sheet of paper has only length and width. In the surface of the paper, at least, it has no thickness. I, on the other hand, am a three-dimensional being. I have length, and I have width, and I have considerable thickness. And it's the thickness dimension which separates me from Flatland. You cannot get me, a three-dimensional being, into a two-dimensional sheet of paper. You can't get me into paper. Now, you can get a front view of me. We have a name for that. It's called a portrait. But a front view of me is a very limited view of me. It doesn't tell you anything about my back or my side or my top. It's just one view of me. You can draw a side view of me. We have a name for that. It's called a profile. And in the story of Flatland, the man in Flatland is shown as a profile. But a profile, again, is only one view of me. You can draw a back view of me. Well, you can draw a top view of me, which in my case is 4 concentric circles. You get that? You know, if we could put that camera up above and look down, what would you see? Bald spot, head, shoulders, belly, 4 circles. But 4 circles isn't all there is to me. You cannot get me, a three-dimensional being, into a two-dimensional sheet of paper. Now, in the story of Flatland, the man who lives in Flatland is visited one day by a sphere. A three-dimensional object. It has an X and a Y and a Z axis. And it just so happens in the story that the sphere crosses Flatland right in the living room of the hero of the story. What happens in Flatland is that a dot appears on this guy's floor out of nothing. Now, if that doesn't make sense to you, just think about it. If I took this tennis ball and dipped it in red paint and touched it to a sheet of paper, what would I get? I'd get a spot, wouldn't I? But realize something. A dot in Flatland is matter. That's what the guy is made of. A line is a series of dots. So when you see the outline of the man in Flatland, what you're seeing is matter, which is produced, in this case, by a sphere touching Flatland. And as the man in Flatland watches in amazement, the dot becomes a circle. If I took this tennis ball and cut a slice out of it, what would I get? I'd get a circle, wouldn't I? But realize something. A circle is made up of lots of dots. It takes a whole bunch of dots to make a circle. So matter is spontaneously being created out of nothing. And as the sphere sinks deeper and deeper into Flatland, the circle gets larger and larger. As the sphere comes down across Flatland, you see the dot appear, it gets larger and larger and larger until the sphere reaches its equator. When it gets to this point, the man in Flatland gets scared because this thing's getting so large, it may push him right out of his own living room. The sphere passes its equator. So what happens to the size of the circle? It becomes smaller. But now you got another violation of the laws of science. Matter energy is being destroyed. And that can't happen. Everything the man in Flatland knows to be true scientifically is not working. But as the sphere goes on through Flatland and the dot becomes smaller and smaller, the circle becomes closer to a dot, and then the thing completely disappears. See, the sphere has gone completely through Flatland. Matter has been completely destroyed. As far as he's concerned, one of the most fundamental laws of science has been violated. Now, as the story develops, the man in Flatland starts to talk to the sphere. And the sphere talks back. And that's a weird experience because when the man in Flatland hears the sphere talk, the sound waves come up through Flatland. So he hears this voice come from all around him and even inside of him. And that blows his mind, but he adjusts to it, and they talk. And the man in Flatland says to the sphere, tell me, what is it like to be a sphere? Now, the sphere thinks he knows how to do this, so he says to the man in Flatland, all right, here's what I want you to do. I want you to draw a circle on your floor. Now, that's not easy. Oh, it is for you and I. We can just take a piece of paper, just go like that, but we're three-dimensional. To the man in Flatland, a circle is a constantly curving line that comes back where it starts. And he can never see a whole circle at one time. The only way he can see a whole circle is to be in the very center of it, where he can look all directions. Because if you look at this picture again, of the man in Flatland looking at the circle, the side on his side is blocking the other side. It is absolutely and completely impossible for him to see a whole circle at one time unless he's in the center of it. And if he ever gets in the center of it, he can never get out. People in Flatland commit suicide by drawing circles around themselves that they can't get out of. Now, if you don't understand that, let me give you a three-dimensional example. Suppose that we made a 12-foot steel ball that was 2 feet thick and you're in the middle of it. Can you ever get out? See, it's the same thing, except he lives only in 2 dimensions. So it's dangerous to draw the circle. It takes him hours. But finally the circle is drawn. And of course the sphere has become very impatient with this because he could have done it instantly. But he finally sees the circle is drawn. He says, boy, whew, I sure am glad you finally got that circle drawn. Now here's what I want you to do. I want you to rotate the circle. See, what he's thinking is that at least in his mind, the man in Flatland can take the circle and go like this. And if you take a circle and go like this, what do you get? Sure, you get a sphere, don't you? But what the man in Flatland does is that he takes a circle and he goes like this. And the sphere says, no, go the other way. So he goes like that. And the man in Flatland, as he tries to understand, just can't visualize it. And as a matter of fact, it is completely impossible for the man in Flatland to totally comprehend the true nature of the sphere. When the sphere says up and down, the man in Flatland is going up and down. It is absolutely and completely impossible for the man in Flatland to totally comprehend the true nature of the sphere. The only thing he can understand about the sphere is the way the sphere manifests itself to him in his own dimension. Now, why have I told you that little story? And why did Edwin Abbott write it? Because, ladies and gentlemen, you are the man in Flatland. Except your Flatland is three-dimensional. And God is the sphere. See, I'm not talking to you about a God in these presentations that is made of gold or silver or stone crafted by art and man's device. That's an ignorant position. It's also a quote of Acts 17, beginning with verse 22. I'm talking about a God that is so superior to us, a God that exists in such a higher dimension than do we, a God who, according to Genesis 1:1, in violation of all of our three-dimensional laws of science, created the earth, the three-dimensional world in which we live. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. You know, the interesting thing is that the Bible has always defined God in this way. The Bible says things like, God is love. The Bible says things like, God is light. Jesus said, God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Jesus said, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee. Flesh and blood didn't do it, but my Father who art in heaven. You can't read the Bible and come to the conclusion that God is an old man in the sky. The Bible says God is not a man. God is eternal. God is everlasting. God is the Word. God is unseen. Every single description of God, from Genesis to Revelation, is totally non-physical, totally non-human. Now somebody say, now, wait. I know the Bible talks about the face of God. I know the Bible talks about the hand of God. That's true, but not when it defines God. That kind of language is used when the Bible is explaining how God interacts with us. Now, we do the same thing. We talk about the long arm of the law. What does that mean? That if you go over the speed limit, a big hand comes out of the sky and picks you up out of your car. No, we're talking about the way the law acts, the consistency of the law. We talk about the face of America. What do we mean? That there's a big face on the ground when you get up in an airplane and look down? Oh, well, of course not. What we're talking about is what the average American believes, what they think is important, what they value. Now, when the Bible explains how God interacts with us, it may use accommodative language. But every time God is defined in the Bible, there are no human characteristics and there are no physical characteristics whatsoever. Now, you struggle with that, don't you? You struggle with that because you live in flatland. And you cannot understand anything that's not a part of your three-dimensional world. You don't believe that? Let me give you a question to show you how true that is. Define the word time. Tell me what time is. You can't do it. You can say, well, if you go 100 miles or 50 miles an hour, that's 2 hours, that's time. But that's not a definition, that's an equivalence. You can say time is God's way of keeping everything from happening at once, but that's not a definition. See, time is a fourth-dimensional quantity. You are a three-dimensional being. It is not possible for a being in a lower dimension to define something higher than itself. I have atheists say to me, I don't believe in God. I can't see Him, I can't smell Him, I can't taste Him, I can't feel Him, I can't hear Him. I don't believe in anything unless I can perceive it through my senses. And my response to that is, oh, really? Do you believe in time? You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it, you can't feel it, you can't hear it. Do you believe in time? I had a debate with an atheist one time, and he said, oh, well, that's different. I can see the effects of time. Well, I suggest to you can also see the effects of God if you're willing to look. It's a cop-out. It's a cop-out to say you won't believe in something unless you can perceive it through your senses, because there are tons of things that you do not perceive through your senses. And yet you believe in them very emphatically. Do you realize we've never seen an atom? Nobody's ever seen a single atom. We've never touched a single atom. We've never tasted one, heard one, felt one. In no way have we perceived a single atom. But we built an atomic bomb. We've never seen a single electron. Nobody has ever taken a single electron, held it up, tasted it, felt it, smelled it, in any way perceived it through our senses. But we have television sets and computers that occasionally work, and microwave ovens and all kinds of things based upon what we think an electron is all about. And the list goes on and on and on and on. Photons, hyperons, cascade particles, neutrinos. Now, how do we do that stuff? Well, let me take an example that you've all had. Somewhere back in your educational experience, probably about third grade, you had a teacher that demonstrated to you that if you take a dead cat and rub it on a comb, the comb will pick up little bits of paper. Remember that? Yeah, that was third grade. Then you got in high school and you did the Dirac version of the Millikan oil drop experiment. And you proved that the mass of an electron is 1/1837th the mass of a proton. That's a 10th grade lab nowadays. And then when you took physics, you learned that electron spins clockwise in a north magnetic field. And everything we know about electrons that allows television sets, that allows microwave ovens, that allows computers, all the things that are a part of our world today, we have because we have understood the electron through its properties. When you have an entity that does not lend itself to empirical observation through your senses, the way you understand that entity is through its properties. Now let's go back to this chart that we had a minute ago. God is. What are these? Yeah, they're properties, aren't they? The Bible is just doing what science has learned to do in the last couple of hundred years, to understand an entity, God, that does not lend itself to empirical observation through our senses by describing God's properties. This is just good science. Every problem we have with God, we have because we don't think and use the tools that are available to us. You know, when I was an atheist, I used to have a lecture that I gave which was titled The Stupidity of God. And in that lecture, I started out quoting 2 Peter 3 and verse 8. Remember the passage? Beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that a day is unto the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. Realize what that's saying? That's saying that God looks at time the way I look at this remote that we're using. I can see the beginning of it, I can see the end of it, I can touch it any place I want. That's the relationship that God has to time. And it's interesting as you look at that kind of relationship to time, that you can't sit back and say, well, that's irrational. But as an atheist, I used to say, boy, that's the silliest thing I ever heard. Everybody knows time's the one ethereal substance. You can't speed it up. You can't slow it down. It's the one thing. It's the same for everybody. But then I took a course in nuclear physics. And in that class, we studied Albert Einstein's theory of special relativity. And if you haven't had any algebra, you might want to take a 2-minute nap right now. We'll be right back. But let me demonstrate something to the junior high kids that are watching this visual presentation. The equation that you see in front of you is an equation for time. T0 is the time you would experience if you weren't moving relative to a given frame of reference. V is the speed at which you move, and C is the speed of light. Now notice something, algebra students. As your speed V gets close to the speed of light C, V squared over C squared gets close to 1. It's 1 minus almost 1, so that number becomes very, very small. And since in the denominator, the value of the fraction becomes very, very large. Okay, what does that mean? It means time dilates. Time gets longer and longer and longer. Okay, non-algebra students, wake up! Let me show this to you in a very simple way. Here we have a picture of two twins. They're exactly the same age. And this is a very famous experiment I'm sure all of you have heard, but let's go through it just for completeness here. If I were to take one twin and put him in a spaceship and send him to the nearest star, traveling at the speed of light, it would take him 4 3/10 years by my watch here up on the earth to the nearest star, to travel to the nearest star, Alpha Centauri A. He gets up there, he eats his lunch, he takes a few pictures, he turns around and comes back. It takes him 4 3/10 more years to travel back. He would have been gone 8 6/10 years, essentially 9 years by my watch here upon the earth. If the two twins were, let's say, 10 years old when he left for the spaceship, when he got back, the other twin would be 18, almost 19 years of age, 18.6 to be exact. The twin on the earth would have continued to age normally, and the twin in the spaceship would not have aged. And some of you are saying, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not talking some kooky theory here. We're talking a proven fact. This is something that can be demonstrated in particle accelerators, in spaceships, in airplanes. I mean, we've essentially done this experiment using very accurate clocks and moving them at high rates of speed. And what we find is that the equation that we started with, it works. It accurately predicts what happens to time. And you know, it's interesting to realize that the statement then that the Bible gives that says time is not an ethereal substance, that time is relative, is a verifiable, workable statement. And the Bible is totally accurate in its description. But Einstein didn't leave it there. And we have a way of testing this. Because there's another part of Einstein's theory. It's called the principle of equivalence. And what it says is that time and space are not different things. They're just different ways of measuring the same thing. Now let me show you how easy that is. If I ask you how far it is from where I live here in Niles, Michigan, to Chicago, Illinois, somebody might say that's 120 miles. But somebody else might say it's 2 hours. You see what happened there? One person measured it in time, one person measured it in space. They're just different ways of measuring the same thing. Now, before you get to thinking this is trivial, let me show you what happens. Suppose I could pull out a magic wand and wave it somehow and stop time. But suppose that you could function normally. Think what you could do. You could get in your automobile and you could drive to Los Angeles, California, and you would be here and you would be in Los Angeles, and you'd be both places now, if I could stop time. Or you could go to Washington, D.C., and you'd be in Los Angeles, and you'd be here, and you'd be in Washington, you'd be all three places now, if I could stop time. Or you could go to the moon, and you wouldn't have to breathe, if I could stop time. You could be everywhere in all places now if I could stop time. Now, I didn't have to tell you that. You said that over and over in your life. How many times have you said, if only I had time, I would do? Now, what you going to do? Something in space. It's hard to believe they gave Einstein all that recognition for something so simple, especially when the biblical writers had already stated it. Look, for example, at the relationship that is described in Jeremiah 10 and verse 23 by God about himself. And he says, am I a God near at hand, and not a God afar off, saith the Lord? Do I not fill heaven and earth, saith the Lord? God's here. God's in Los Angeles. God's in Washington, D.C., believe it or not. He fills all of space now. And Einstein says, yes, a God unlimited in time has to be unlimited in space, because time and space are inseparably linked. It would have been so easy for the biblical writers to have botched this concept, and they didn't miss one single step. So we've talked about the nature of God. How does that answer the questions of what is God? Where did he come from? What is man? Where did he come from? What sex is God? What race is God? Why do bad things happen to good people? We hope you'll continue with the next video presentation, because what we want to do in the next video is to take what we've just developed and show you that all of those questions are really quite easy to answer. We'll look forward to talking about that in the next video.
Does God Exist is an educational program which attempts to provide evidence that man can logically believe in God and that the Christian system presented in the New Testament is the best option for successful living. We offer materials free and on loan. Contact us by mail, fax, or email for a catalog, to request materials, or just to ask questions. Does God exist may be the most important question you will ever ask.